What if I told you that a single action taken to secure Europe's industrial future was the very thing that would guarantee its unraveling? How could a move designed to protect European automakers become the very weapon that crushes them? The unraveling of the European automotive industry, a sector once synonymous with global industrial preeminence, is not a story of a single sudden collapse. It is a chronicle of 1,000 cuts, a slow motion crisis born of regulatory burdens, fierce new competition, and most recently, a catastrophic miscalculation in geopolitical strategy. At the heart of this latest and perhaps most devastating chapter lies the case of Nexperia, a Chinese owned semiconductor manufacturer headquartered in the Netherlands. The Dutch government's decision to seize this company, intended as a show of sovereign strength, has instead become a textbook example of a catastrophic self inflicted wound. It has exposed the profound fragility of Europe's supply chains, demonstrated a critical misunderstanding of where true industrial power lies in the 21st century, and provided a hostile trading partner with the perfect weapon to bring Europe's most vital industry to its knees. This is the story of how that seizure is crushing European automakers. The first domino fell on September 30th when the Dutch government initiated a highly exceptional move that sent shockwaves through global technology and manufacturing circles. It announced that it was seizing control of Nexperia, a major semiconductor manufacturer whose corporate headquarters were located in Nijmegen, Netherlands. While the headquarters were Dutch, the ownership was not. Nexperia was a subsidiary of Wingtech Technology, a prominent Chinese firm, making this action a direct and hostile intervention against a major economic and geopolitical rival. This was not a mere regulatory fine or a slap on the wrist. It was a full scale seizure of a foreign owned private asset. The legal instrument chosen for this extraordinary intervention was in itself a profound statement. The government invoked the Goods Availability Act, a statute resurrected from the darkest days of the Cold War. This law had been designed to protect the Netherlands from existential supply disruptions orchestrated by the Soviet bloc, and its reemergence signaled that the Dutch government was framing the Nexperia situation not as a mere commercial dispute, but as a matter of national survival. The invocation of this dormant emergency powers law underscored the severity of the action and the government's readiness to escalate the simmering economic conflict with China into a new, far more confrontational phase. Officially, the Dutch government laid out a tripartite rationale for its decision, painting a picture of a nation acting responsibly to protect its own interests and those of the wider European Union. The primary justification was, unsurprisingly, national and European economic security. In an era where semiconductors are often called the new oil, control over their production and distribution is paramount. The Hague argued that allowing a company of such strategic importance to remain under the full control of a Chinese parent posed an unacceptable risk. They claimed this was a defensive measure to safeguard the technological sovereignty of the continent. Secondly, the government cited serious governance shortcomings within Nexperia. This accusation was notably vague, offering little in the way of concrete public evidence. It served as a useful, if opaque, justification, allowing officials to hint at internal malfeasance or non-compliance without needing to air specific, provable charges. This allegation of shortcomings provided a necessary legal and public relations cover, framing the seizure as a reluctant response to a poorly managed company rather than a premeditated geopolitical gambit. Finally, and most ironically, the government stated its goal was to prevent a situation in which the goods produced by Nexperia would become unavailable in an emergency. This rationale was purely preemptive. It was based on the fear of a future supply cutoff orchestrated by Beijing. The Dutch government's stated aim was to ensure the continued flow of these critical components to European industry. This preventative logic would soon be exposed as a fatal flaw, as the very act of preventing a hypothetical supply disruption would become the catalyst that created a real and immediate one. While the official statements focused on governance and hypothetical emergencies, the true motives for the seizure were transparently geopolitical, rooted far more in Washington, D.C. than in The Hague. Reports indicated that the seizure was carried out at the strong insistence of the United States, which had been waging an aggressive, years long economic chip war to halt China's technological ascent. The Netherlands, as a key U.S. ally and critically the home of the indispensable lithography giant ASML, had been under immense pressure to align with American policy and sever its technological ties with China. The smoking gun validating this perspective was the status of Nexperia's parent company, WingTech Technology. In December of 2024, WingTech had been officially placed on the United States Entity List. This blacklisting, a powerful tool of American economic statecraft, effectively barred U.S. companies from doing business with WingTech without explicit government permission. The Dutch seizure of WingTech's prized European asset just months later was viewed by Beijing and by many neutral observers as a clear act of compliance. The Netherlands, it appeared, was acting as America's proxy, sacrificing its own economic relationship with China to serve Washington's foreign policy agenda. This context transforms the Dutch rationale from a defensive measure into an offensive one. The stated reasons were seen as a thin veneer for a politically motivated asset seizure. The criticism, which mounted almost immediately, was that the decision was based on fears over facts. The Dutch government provided no concrete evidence of active technology transfer, no proof of an imminent threat, no specific examples of the governance shortcomings it cited. Instead, the justification was built entirely on a foundation of possibilities, ifs, and mays, a precarious legal standing for seizing a multi-billion-dollar private corporation. It set a dangerous global precedent that national security could be invoked based on potential future threats rather than actual demonstrated wrongdoing. The execution of the seizure was as brutal as it was swift. The ministerial order did not just place the company under observation, it immediately suspended WingTech's chairman, Zhang Jinghing, from his executive roles within Nexperia. This was a corporate decapitation designed to sever the Chinese parent's control instantly and completely. Wingtech's response was one of predictable outrage. The company issued a statement decrying the seizure as an excessive intervention driven by geopolitical bias rather than a fact based risk assessment. This counter narrative resonated strongly, particularly as the devastating economic fallout began to crystallize. The Dutch government, in its haste to appease its geopolitical ally, had overlooked a simple, catastrophic fact. They were seizing the wrong part of the company. The Netherlands' fundamental error was a spectacular failure of due diligence, one rooted in an antiquated Western centric view of corporate value. The Dutch action gave them legal control over the Nexperia headquarters in Nijmegen. They seized the address, the corporate nameplate, the intellectual property rights registered in Europe, and the executive offices. In their minds, they had seized the company. They had captured the C suite, the marketing departments, and the legal structures, the elements that, in a traditional Western pro framework, represent the brain and thus the value of the enterprise. But the reality of modern globalized manufacturing is vastly different. The true value of Nexperia, its industrial heart, was not located in that Dutch office building. The critical assets, the actual factories, the assembly lines, the foundries, and the skilled workforce that produced the physical goods were located thousands of miles away, primarily in China, in locations like Dongguan. The Dutch had successfully seized the mailbox, as one critic put it, while China retained absolute control of the house. The scale of this miscalculation is staggering when one considers the production volume. The Dongguan facility alone is a manufacturing behemoth responsible for producing over 6 billion basic semiconductors every single month. This culminates in an annual production volume of over 50 to 60 billion chips. These are not the advanced headline grabbing 2 nanometer or 3 nanometer chips used for artificial intelligence. Rather, they are legacy or basic semiconductors, the workhorse components that are nonetheless the absolute lifeblood of modern industry. They are the essential chips used in power management, in car networks, and sensor controls. A single modern automobile can contain hundreds, if not thousands, of these seemingly simple components. The Dutch government's flawed logic was that by seizing the headquarters, they could control this vast manufacturing empire. They believed that the factories in China would simply follow the orders of the new state appointed management in the Netherlands. This assumption displayed a profound ignorance of both their own leverage and China's. They had initiated an act of economic warfare against China, while the entirety of their prize, the physical asset they claimed to be securing for Europe, was located deep inside Chinese territory, entirely at the mercy of the very government they had just antagonized. Beijing's response was neither delayed nor nuanced. It was as swift as it was predictable and utterly devastating. Almost immediately, beginning on October 4th, the Chinese government retaliated. It did not need to deploy warships or engage in complex diplomatic negotiations. It simply blocked the export of all Nexperia's finished semiconductor products from its factories in China. With the stroke of a pen, the tap was turned off. The very goods the Netherlands had seized Nexperia to secure were now trapped inside China, unable to reach the European customers who desperately needed them. This export ban was coupled with a logistical masterstroke that finalized the company's vivisection. The company was effectively and instantly split in two. Nexperia China's management, acting with the clear backing of the Chinese government, posted a notice on the social media platform WeChat. This internal memo instructed all employees in China to ignore any and all instructions, communications, or orders originating from the Dutch headquarters. Whether these orders came via Outlook, Microsoft Teams, or direct email, they were to be disregarded. Chinese staff were explicitly told to follow instructions only from the local Nexperia China management. This single move rendered the Dutch seizure utterly powerless. The Netherlands was left in control of an empty corporate shell in Nijmegen, complete with executives who could send emails that would never be read and issue orders that would never be followed. China was left in control of the actual factories, the products, and the entire workforce. The seizure had created a zombie company in Europe, while China had nationalized the productive assets in all but name, all while claiming to be the victim of a hostile foreign action. The Dutch had not secured a vital asset. They had merely created a powerless corporate orphan while handing their chief rival a fully formed, state aligned manufacturing giant. The abstract world of geopolitics and corporate seizures collided with harsh physical reality on the factory floors of Germany. Volkswagen, the icon of European industry and the continent's largest car maker, was the first to sound the alarm. The company announced that it was implementing temporary pauses in the production of its key models, most notably the Volkswagen Golf. The Golf, a vehicle that has been in continuous production for decades and is a symbol of German engineering and reliability, was suddenly grinding to a halt. Initially, Volkswagen's management attempted to control the narrative, releasing statements that the production holds were long planned measures intended to manage inventory and coordinate logistics. This corporate speak was a thin veil for a rapidly escalating crisis. As pressure mounted, the automaker was forced to admit the truth. While Nexperia was not one of its direct suppliers, its components were deeply embedded in the supply chain. Volkswagen confessed that Nexperia made components do reach its factories indirectly through its tier one suppliers, the major parts manufacturers who build complex modules like braking systems or infotainment units, and sell them directly to VW. The Nexperia chips were in those modules, and with the flow from China cut off, VW's tier one suppliers could no longer build the parts. The disruption rippled upward, and the assembly lines fell silent. Volkswagen's admission that short term effects on production cannot be ruled out was a dramatic understatement. The crisis was already here. The true depth of the panic at Volkswagen's Wolfsburg headquarters was revealed in reports from the German newspaper Bild. According to the paper, the company was preparing for far more than a short term pause. Volkswagen management had already begun discussions with German labor authorities about the possibility of introducing a state backed reduced working hours program. This program, known in Germany as Kurzarbeit, is an emergency measure used in times of deep recession where the government subsidizes the wages of employees to prevent mass layoffs. The fact that VW was even considering this option signaled that it was preparing for a prolonged and severe disruption. This single move had the potential to directly affect the livelihoods of tens of thousands of employees, demonstrating in stark human terms the immediate and devastating consequences of the Netherlands' geopolitical blunder. And Volkswagen was not alone. Reports quickly surfaced that BMW and other major European manufacturers were in a similar crisis mode, scrambling to assess their own exposure to the Nexperia cutoff. The Nexperia crisis did not strike a healthy industry, it struck an industry already on its knees. The European automotive sector was and is profoundly vulnerable. For years, it has been battling a perfect storm of headwinds. It has faced punitive tariffs in global markets, has been struggling with weak consumer demand in a sluggish post pandemic economy, and most critically, is facing existential competition from a wave of efficient, technologically advanced, and aggressively priced electric vehicles, EVs from Chinese automakers like BYD, Geely, and SAIC. European car makers were already in a desperate fight for survival, struggling to retool their factories and ramp up their own EV production. In this context, the industry cannot afford another supply shock. The warnings from industry bodies were immediate and apocalyptic. Germany's powerful automotive lobby, the VDA, issued a dire statement warning that the China Netherlands dispute could to significant production restrictions in the near future. This was a diplomatic way of saying their members were about to shut down. The European Automotive Manufacturers Association, ASIA, which represents the entire continent's industry, was even more blunt. They stated unequivocally that without Nexperia's chips, European suppliers simply cannot build the parts and components needed to supply the vehicle manufacturers. This, the ACEA warned, directly threatens production stoppages on a mass scale. The association went on to trace the inevitable and vicious cycle that would follow. Production stoppages would not just mean delayed cars, they would mean immediate layoffs. Mass layoffs would lead to a sharp increase in unemployment, particularly in manufacturing heavy regions like Germany and Eastern Europe. This unemployment would in turn further crush consumer confidence and destroy demand, leading to fewer car sales and triggering more production stoppages. It is a death spiral from which the industry may not be able to recover. This ripple effect, however, extends far beyond the headline grabbing automakers. The true cascading devastation is occurring one level down in the often invisible ecosystem of Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. These are the specialized, family owned businesses, the German Mittelstand, that form the backbone of European manufacturing. Unlike Volkswagen or BMW, these companies do not have billions in cash reserves or the political clout to demand state backed furlough schemes. They operate on thinner margins and more rigid production schedules. For them, a sudden cutoff of a single critical component is not an inconvenience, it is an extinction level event. These suppliers are now facing a catastrophic choice: either default on their own contracts to the major automakers, triggering penalties and permanent reputational damage, or shut down operations entirely, laying off a highly skilled workforce that may never be recovered. The Nexperia seizure is therefore acting as a poison injected directly into the capillaries of the industrial body, guaranteeing a slow and agonizing necrosis long after the initial shock has passed. Furthermore, the long term strategic damage of this highly exceptional move will far outweigh the immediate economic pain. The Netherlands, acting as a proxy for wider EU divided by US interests, has shattered the foundational myth that Europe is a stable, reliable, and rules based jurisdiction for foreign investment. This single act of seizure, based on vague fears rather than proven malfeasance, has sent a chilling message to every non Western investor on the planet. What is to stop a similar seizure of a Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund's assets in a European port or an Indian conglomerate's factory should their home country's foreign policy diverge from that of Washington or Brussels? The Goods Availability Act has created a blueprint for legal expropriation based on geopolitical alignment. This has fatally undermined the EU's global standing as a premier investment destination. Capital is cowardly. It flows to where it is treated best. In the future, why would a non aligned nation choose to build its critical manufacturing presence in Europe where it could be seized on a whim when it could instead invest in Asia, South America, or the Middle East, where the rules, even if stringent, are at least predictable? This decision has effectively placed a massive political risk premium on all future foreign direct investment into the European Union. In this new multipolar world, trust is the most valuable currency. With one move, the Dutch government has depleted Europe's reserves. Worse still, it has handed China an unearned and monumental propaganda victory. Beijing can now rightfully portray itself to the global south as the victim of arbitrary Western overreach and a stable partner for development, in stark contrast to a volatile Europe that seizes assets based on allegiance. The Nexperia seizure did not just fail to secure a supply chain, it actively sabotaged Europe's industrial base, crippled its smaller suppliers, and broadcasted to the world that its legal protections are subordinate to its political anxieties. This is the sound of an economic bloc deliberately and foolishly sawing off the very branch it is sitting on. This entire unfolding disaster brings the central irony of the seizure into sharp focus. The Dutch government's stated purpose, as outlined in its Goods Availability Act justification, was to ensure the availability of these critical chips and prevent an emergency. Instead, their action is the sole and direct cause of the chips becoming unavailable. They have handedly manufactured the very crisis they claimed to be preventing. This is not just a policy failure, it is a catastrophic self inflicted wound, a strategic blunder of historic proportions that has sacrificed Europe's most important industry on the altar of geopolitical alignment. The Nexperia seizure is crushing European automakers because it represents a fatal disconnect between geopolitical ambition and industrial reality. Driven by a desire to align with the United States' hardline stance against China, the Dutch government executed a hostile seizure of a Chinese owned company. This act, however, was fundamentally flawed by a catastrophic miscalculation. They seized the European corporate nameplate, while the physical manufacturing assets, the actual factories producing 60 billion chips per year, remained secure within China's borders. The Netherlands' move was perceived not as a seizure of a company, but as the taking of a hostage. China's retaliation was to prove that the hostage was worthless. By immediately banning the export of Nexperia's products from its Chinese factories, Beijing flicked a kill switch that severed a critical artery supplying the entire European automotive sector. The consequences are not theoretical or distant, they are immediate and devastating. The halting of production lines at Volkswagen for iconic models like the Golf, the activation of emergency labor plans threatening tens of thousands of jobs, and the crisis mode declarations from BMW and other manufacturers are the first tremors of an earthquake. The seizure has provided China with a government sanctioned defensive reason to turn off the supply of components that Europe's already vulnerable auto industry desperately needs to survive. In its attempt to prove its strategic relevance, the Netherlands, and by extension, the EU, has only succeeded in demonstrating its profound economic dependence, crippling its own industrial heartland in the process.